I think it's time to start. Good evening to everyone. I would like to welcome you to the seminar of the Center for Institutional Studies. We are very pleased to have as our speaker tonight Riccardo Camboni from the University of Padova. He is an old friend and a young old friend and colleague of ours. He spoke many times before. And Riccardo has his degrees from University of Verona and Padova. His main field is public procurement. And he knows this field not only from his academic perspective, but also by spending time serving for the Italian anti-corruption agency. Riccardo is involved in the center's collaboration with his university, with Italian colleagues on the issues of public procurement. This field is managed and supervised from our side by Professor Podkolzina, and we're very glad to have her here as well. So tonight, Bernardo's talk is setting reserve prices in repeated procurement auctions. Riccardo, you know the rules. We ask you to please stay within the 45 time limit, and then we'll have a discussion.
Okay.
Prego, signor. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So let me share the screen now. Now, can you confirm me you can see the...
We do. Yes, you're all good.
Okay, let me just show. Okay, now I think it's better, isn't it? Okay, so, well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you, Leonid, for the presentation, and thank you very much for the invitation. And so the work I'm going to present is a joint work with Elena Podkolzina, which is today with us, with Sumera Atmaka and Cohen Shores from the Ghent University in Belgium, and from Paola Valbonesi, which is as me from Padua. So this is a work which really took a lot of time to be completed, but I think we've arrived. So it is the first time that I'm presenting the entire work, with all the analysis, and we think this will be the final picture, and we probably will have the working paper in a month or so. Now, given the place, I don't have to convince you about the importance of public procurement. Public procurement market accounts for about 12% of the GDP in developed countries. And when using public money to purchase goods, services, or works, the main goal of the public procurer is obtaining the best value for money. That is, using the MAPS survey, the best system should provide the required goods, work, and services in an economic, efficient, effective, and sustainable way. And in doing so, public procurer, both in terms of institution and in terms of the officials and bureaucrats managing the purchasing, play a crucial role for the efficiency of the process and the result. And this represents a significant departure from the standard literature where the role of the auctioneer is purely passive. And the final price depends solely on the market condition, technological cost of the good, and the number of suppliers entering the auction. While at the same time, this is a double-edged sword, especially when the procurers lack competencies, like in Society Role or in, to quote another important paper, Bandiera Prata e Balletti. Now, what is the role of the public buyer? Well, first of all, the public buyer needs to identify and describe the needs of the item or services that is awarded. And second is to choose the awarding procedure. That is, should I use a first price auction? Should I use a scoring auction within quality and price? Should I go into a direct negotiation with a supplier? And so on. Contract design and management, so writing down all the documents. And this is what we are going to focus today in setting the reserve price. Now, the reserve price, which is, let me just jump on the next slide and I will come back. The reserve price is simply the maximum announced the willingness to pay for the good or the service awarded. Every price offer which is above in a procurement setting, above the reserve price set by the auctioneer, set by the public buyer, this offer will be automatically discarded. And this is a key design parameter in the auction design because first it influences the competition in the auction, and second, it indirectly influences the price paid by the buyer because a lower reserve price will reduce the number of bidders entering the auction. Now, when setting the reserve price, the auctioneer and the public buyer face a trade-off. On the one hand, setting a low reserve price decreases the expected winning bid, and this can be theoretically demonstrated. But on the other hand, it increases the risk of having no suppliers entering the auction, because if the price set is too low, no one is willing to provide the good or the service for this price. So nobody will enter the auction, and the auction goes void, which is bad for the auctioneer. On the other hand, setting a high reserve price reverses the problem. So it will reduce the risk of no bidders entering the auction, but the final price paid will be higher. Sorry, I have a problem. Yep. So if we go to the theory auction literature, we see that in a one-shot, and it will be crucial, this one-shot, in a one-shot procurement setting, so when the public buyer is managing an auction, completely isolated from previous auction, previous experiences or other stuff, it turns out that it is optimal for the buyer to exclude some bidders. That is, to set an announced willingness to pay, which is lower than its true willingness to pay. And in this way, the public buyer is excluding some bidder, even if their cost is below the true maximum willingness to pay of that public buyer. And the reason is that it is optimal to have a reserve price which is a bit below in order to decrease the final price to be paid in the auction, the expected final price that will be paid in the auction by the public buyer. And this optimal reserve price finally does not depend on the number of the bidders. Now, the novelty of our paper is that we're going to study setting the reserve price in a repeated procurement purchasing. So you can think of this as a given public buyer which is running a first auction, and this first auction is exploited by that public buyer in order to collect information about the production cost of the winning supplier. So in forthcoming auctions, this public buyer will exploit this information which were previously gained in order to set the reserve price. So once we introduce this dynamic framework, once we allow for public buyer to gain experience and to gain additional information from previous auction, how does the reserve price change and what are the effects on competition and on the price paid by the public buyer? So this is the main research question of our paper, and we are going to assess it both from an empirical perspective using Russian data and from a theory perspective. That is how the standard optimal reserve price problem changes once we allow the public buyer to have additional information about one supplier. Now, to go more in detail, we will first provide empirical evidence, both descriptive and econometric, of variation in the reserve price, which are specific of some buyer-supplier pairs. That is, I'm going to show you that in some cases, a given public buyer is systematically setting a reserve price which is lower when the auction is won by a given supplier. And this is time inconsistent with a one-shot auction because the reserve price is set before the public buyer knows the winning supplier, the identity of the winning supplier. Now, this will not be a story of corruption because the reserve price is lower. And as we're going to see, also the final price paid by the contractor will be lower. That's the reason why I stressed a lot about the competence and the abilities and not about the corruption part of the story. Now, our conjecture is that the public buyer is exploiting additional information on the winning supplier. And we are going to use a dynamic econometric model to show that this is indeed the case. Past interaction of the procurer with the winning supplier influences the setting of the reserve price. And finally, I'm going to present you a theory model which rationalizes our empirical result. Now, the key assumption of the theory model is that the public buyer observes the production cost of one supplier. And as a result, I'm going to show that first, letting the optimal reserve price is equal or lower than the one the public buyer would have set absent that information. And second, that also the winning price and competition are lower too. So this is good news for the public buyer. Now, we are going to connect with three streams of literature. So the first is about the benefits of bureaucratic discretion in procurement. Setting the reserve price is a key discretional decision of the public buyer. Sometimes it is good to give additional discretion to the public buyer, sometimes it is better. The literature is not clear-cut on this issue, but there is a strong stream of literature showing that it is a good idea to give additional discretion to the public buyer. We are also connecting to the growing literature about the role of the public buyer. This is the importance of the public buyer and the auctioneer in the outcome of the procurement process. And finally, this is more a theory literature. We are also connecting to the theory literature studying the revenue maximizing reserve price from the perspective of the auctioneer. Now, the seminar result is the one I just discussed before. The exclusion principle, a revenue maximizing public buyer should always set a reserve price that is below his or her true willingness to pay in a procurement setting. In a direct auction, this will be reversed, of course. And well, there are several papers that addresses the limitation of this result, like, for example, correlated bidder's value, risk-averse bidder, bounded rationality, collusion. We're going to introduce one additional reason where this exclusion principle does not hold. I'm sorry, I do have a small problem with the mouse, but I think I will do it.
Sounds good so far.
Okay, so we are going to use Russian public procurement data. Well, I don't think I have to explain to you. You probably are much better than me in explaining the legal setting of the public procurement in Russia. So I will do my best. So public procurement in Russia is run under a unified procurement system, the Federal Law 94, where we have federal, provincial, and municipal public buyers. There are two main awarding mechanisms which we are going to use in our dataset. So the first is the standard sealed bid auction. All the bidders submit an offer in a closed envelope, then the envelopes are opened, and the lowest price wins. And then we have the e-auction. The e-auction can be thought for our purposes as a two-step procedure. So in a first step, all the suppliers submit a request to participate to the auction. Then the public buyer will admit all the suppliers to satisfy the requirement set in the tender. And then there is the final auction with all the bidders that have been admitted, and the lowest price wins. Our data will stop in 2014 as there was a policy change, essentially. So in order not to introduce any additional distortion in our result. We got data, of course, on Russian data. We have about 80,000 auction for an homogeneous good, which is gasoline. So we are going to use gasoline because we want to avoid from any unobserved quality differentiation in the good procured. So as far as I know, the only important quality differentiation in the gasoline good is about the octane rating, what we're going to observe it. The suppliers are typically gas station, there is no outsourcing, and all the auctions are awarded using first price auction. We're going to cover about 83 different Russian regions in the period of 2011 to 2013, and we are going to augment our data with mostly regional market prices for gasoline types in order to take into consideration the dynamic of the gasoline market when studying the prices paid by the public buyer in purchasing gasoline. Now this is summary statistic of the data we have available. So I will not stop a lot on this, but on the summary statistic, but I will come back if necessary when studying the result of the regression. Now, we are concerned about the surprise, so a regression studying the determinants of the surprise is the first step that we are going to do in the empirical analysis. In a procurement tender, each public buyer, when setting the surprise, takes into account, well, the item market price, the market competition, some specific time, local characteristic, and maybe we also have some public buyer fixed effect. And we are going to take all of these observable heterogeneity into consideration in our regression equation. On top of that, we are going to add the procurer-seller fixed effect on surprise. So we are going to study if the surprise changes when an auction awarded by a specific buyer I has been won by a specific supplier J. Now, in this specification, we do not have public buyer fixed effect explicitly, but we have them indirectly, as the average procurer-seller fixed effect is simply the procurer fixed effect, the overall procurer fixed effect. Now, this is the result of the regression, which is really standard. We are not interested about the outcome of this regression, except that for the fixed effect, which I'm going to discuss in a moment. I will simply show that, as we can expect, the higher the market price, for whatever reason, the higher the reserve price. And this is consistent with some sort of rational behavior, rational setting of the reserve price by the public buyer. And we also see that municipal buyers on average set a higher reserve price, and the same in the volume purchased. Now, differences, let me go to what is the crucial point of the analysis. Differences in the reserve price, according to the identity of the public buyer, are reasonable. First, well, market condition, geographical segmentation. Second, because officials can use different sources to establish prices. They have different price quotation, and so on. And third, because bureaucrats have different set of competencies and abilities. So differences in terms of public buyer in setting the reserve price are unsurprisingly. What we should not observe in our data is that, well, a public buyer should not be found to have set a different reserve price for different winning suppliers. So if I am public buyer I, it's reasonable that my reserve price is different from public buyer B. But if I am public buyer I should not be found to set a reserve price which is systematically different for some suppliers. Like for supplier J, I'm setting a reserve price, for supplier K, I'm setting a reserve price, and so on. And why this is the case? Because we have a time inconsistency. The reserve price is set before the winning of the auction is known to the public buyer. In this paper, we are going to study deviation of the reserve price, which are, well, we are going to study the case where the reserve price set by a given public buyer when interacting with one supplier is lower than the average reserve price set by that specific public buyer. Now, in principle, both variation, upward and downward, are worth examination, are worth to be examined, because we should not observe any deviation like upward or downward. The problem of upward deviation is that we are not able to exclude corruption, because higher reserve price may well be explained by corruption. And indeed, we have some authors have a companion paper, Elena Podkolzina, co-insurance at MACA, have a companion paper studying upward deviation in the reserve price, taking into consideration the issue of corruption. But in this paper, we are not concerned about corruption. That's the reason why we use the downward variation in the reserve price only. So we are going to define the reserve price discount strategy, and we are going to flag all the observation where we have the reserve price discount strategy as all the case where a procurer P and a seller, where the reserve price set by procurer P in contracts won by seller I is systematically lower than the average resale price for auction of similar characteristics awarded by that specific public buyer. That is, the fixed effect procurer supplier is lower than the fixed effect of the procurer alone, of the average fixed effect of the procurer. Now, this is a relevant time inconsistency in the data, which is observed in a non-negligible number of observations. About 20% of observations in our dataset exhibit this variation, exhibit this resale price discount strategy, which accounts for about 1/10 pairs of public buyer and supplier. Now, how does an auction where we have the resale price discount strategy change with respect to an auction where we don't have this? Well, first of all, we do have lower competition. Whenever the resale price discount strategy is present, we do have lower competition. We're going to use as a variable for competition 5 different variables. So the first one is the applicants, which is the number of suppliers entering the auction, whether they have been excluded or not. We're going to see if our result is driven by excluded bidders. So we observe a lower competition only because more bidders are excluded. We're going to see if our result is driven by the decision of the suppliers not to bid in the second stage of the auction, in the auction. And we are going to run also a Prob model assessing whether, where we have the resale price discount strategy, it is more likely to have auction with just one bidder. And what we got is that whenever you have this resale price discount strategy, as just described, we have a lower number of applicants, a lower number of non-excluded bidders, and this result is not driven by either excluded bidder, by the public buyer, either bidders that have chosen not to enter the second stage of the auction. And we also observe an increase in the probability of having just one bidder in the auction. We are also going to exploit the fact that we observe the identities of all the suppliers in our dataset. So we do have in our dataset data on the winning bidder and data on the identity of all the suppliers. And we see that whenever this resale price discount strategy exists, this particular supplier is more likely to win an auction managed by that public buyer. If you have a resale price discount strategy, if we are going to observe that the resale price is systematically set lower by a public buyer J when the auction is won by a supplier I, this supplier has a higher probability of winning the auction. Sorry, here it is. And finally, our empirical evidence, and this is the reason why we do not think this is a corruption story, our empirical evidence shows that in the 20% of observation where we have the resale price discount strategy, the final price paid by the public buyer, the winning bidder, is lower. So, okay. So far, we have an identity of the winning supplier reduces the resale price, which were previously set by the public buyer. And here it is the time inconsistency. This should not be the case when the public and the effect of this is lower competition, which is bad, but also lower price, which is good. Now, the intuition that we have, but so far this is just an intuition, is that the public buyer is using additional information on the winning supplier. And those additional information were gained in previous auction. Now, so far this is an intuition. What I'm going to show you now is first, empirical evidence supporting this intuition, and second, a theory model which is rationalizing this, so which is explaining us why this happens. Let's begin with the empirical evidence. Now, if this is the case, we should observe, and I will give you the intuition of all this context model, and I will go to all the details, all the econometric bits. It should be the case that the reserve price, which is set at time t, is influenced by previous interaction, the number of previous interaction between the public buyer and the winning supplier, if the reserve price discount strategy is in place. Now, how I'm going to prove this result? I'm going to prove it using a two-step model. We're going to exploit our unitary price equation model, so the regression which we already estimated from there. From this equation, we got all the parameters which explain me the impact of the heterogeneous observed differences in the good procured on the reserve price. And we are going to clean our reserve price from all these observed heterogeneity. That is, using the estimated coefficient beta and gamma, we define the standardized unit reserve price prime as the difference between the observed reserve price and the impact of all the observable characteristics, both in the characteristic of the good and time, place, fixed effect. So what's left is a dataset of standardized homogeneous unit reserve price. The logic is that this is the reserve price that the public buyer would have set for the procurement of a standardized good, which is exactly equal across our entire dataset. And then we are going to construct a variable, I'm going to call this variable transaction, which measures the number of time the public buyer J has interacted with the procurer I from t=0, so from the beginning of our dataset to the day before this specific auction takes place. And the specification we're going to use is indeed quite flexible, because first of all, we separate depending if this is the second time they interact. So the first time is they never interacted before. So this is the second time they interact, or they've already interacted once, at least once. So we are going to allow for the possibility of a nonlinear effect coming from the fact that this is the first time they are interacting again, or more than, or they have already interacted more than once. And second, we are interacting this variable with the reserve price discount strategy. And what we got is that the unit reserve price set by the public buyer is decreasing in the number of transactions, so in the number of times they have interacted before, when the reserve price discount strategy is in place, but not, or even increasing, when the reserve price discount is not in place, which is a supporting evidence of our claim. Now, so far I've presented you, well, how can I summarize? Okay, let me say it that way. Let me repeat again the crucial results that we got from all this empirical exercise. And the crucial result is that in a non-negligible number of observations, the reserve price depends on the identity of the winning supplier. And this should not be the case, because this is time inconsistent. In this auction, which we have labeled as exhibiting the reserve price discount strategy, we found that the winning price and the participation in the auction are lower than in the remaining part of our dataset. We conjecture that public buyers are exploiting information they have gained on previous auction. And indeed, it turns out that previous auction won by the same suppliers have an influence on the reserve price, which is now set by the public buyer. Now, what I'm going now to do is to show you a theory model which rationalized this evidence. This is a super standard auction model with one crucial addition only. Now, this is a super standard auction theory model because we have a risk-neutral public buyer which aims to purchase an item using a first price auction. We have whatever value for the buyer, parameter V, and the buyer is choosing the reserve price, R. And the goal of the model is to assess what is the optimal reserve price the public buyer should set. We have two potential suppliers entering the auction, 1 and 2. I'm calling them potential suppliers because this supplier have a cost to produce the good, CI, which is drawn from a generic distribution F. We support 0 omega. And both suppliers are risk neutral. They each know their own cost, but they only know the distribution of the cost of the other bidder, so the cost distribution function. And each supplier will enter the auction if and only if the reserve price set by the public buyer is greater than their marginal cost in producing the good. If the reserve price is lower, the maximum price the public buyer is willing to pay is lower than my cost. So there is no point for me in entering the auction because I would get negative profits. Now this is super standard, and you got the standard bidding function, which is given by this quite complex equation. Now this comes from a paper from 1980, Holt. So this is really nothing new in the auction literature. The crucial thing that we are going to introduce in this model is that the public buyer observes the cost of one of the two suppliers, and we denote the cost of price the public buyer would is exactly what we got for the reserve price discount strategy. And as this is the lowest possible reserve price without participation of the winning supplier, we got also that the price is the lowest possible. Indeed, the public buyer is obtaining all the samples from the winning supplier in this setting. Yes, if it depends on the channel through which the public buyer learns the cost of the observed supplier. If the public buyer learns the cost of the observed supplier through the contract execution stage, then our result still holds. If the public buyer learns the cost of the observed suppliers through the bids, our result no longer holds because the supplier understands that when he's setting the bid, he is also giving away information about true cost that will then be used by the public buyer. But for reasons which I've written in the paper, we can discuss later on, we think that this is not the case. So to conclude, I must stay in time in the 45 minutes. So in this paper, we asked ourselves how public buyers set the reserve price in presence or absence of information on one potential supplier production margin cost. So how does the setting of the reserve price changes when the public buyer observes the cost of one supplier? Now, our empirical results show that for some observation, for some auction, about 1/5 in our dataset, the reserve price that the public buyer is setting when interacting with one specific supplier is lower than the reserve price that the same public buyer is setting with all the other suppliers. And this is time inconsistent if we think at a one-shot first price auction. However, this result can be rationalized in a auction theory setting where the public buyer has learned some additional information about who will be the winning supplier. And in this case, it is rational for the public buyer to decrease its own reserve price in this case. And whenever this is the case, competition and prices are all lower than in the case when the public buyer has not such information. Now, what are the long-term effects on the dynamic efficiency of the market? Well, for us, this is unclear. Because on the one hand, we are decreasing the price, so this sounds good for the public buyer. But on the other hand, the reserve price discount strategy, by decreasing the reserve price, may act as an entry barrier for new firms to enter the market. And moreover, whenever the reserve price is inducing a situation where just one bidder enters the auction, as it is in many cases in our observation, this in the long term may be a channel to which an improper relationship of favoritism is built between this supplier and the public buyer. So thank you very much. I was 1 minute late.
Okay, excellent, Riccardo. Thanks very much. Plenty of food for thought. Solid theory and interesting empirics. So let's see if we have any discussion. The topic is quite narrow and technical, but interesting and important one. So hopefully you will get some feedback. Anyone wants to comment on Riccardo's paper, please? Questions? Bernardo, please. Bernardo? Go ahead. Your mic is off, Bernardo. Can you turn on your mic? You're muted. Or you cannot unmute. We have some issues. Give me just 1 second, guys. 1 moment, please. I'll try to do something. This is because we're moving host rights back and forth between myself and Victoria. So it'll take just 1 sec. Sorry about that. Oh, Jesus. One moment. Okay, now I'm in control. So the aircraft is operational, hopefully. And Bernardo, please try to unmute yourself. Can you do it? Or still cannot? That's okay. How about now? Can you do it now?
Oh yes, finally. Okay, thanks.
Okay, excellent.
Hi,
Sorry about
that. Hi, Riccardo. Thanks for the presentation. I have one question, well, related to like the first line of the conclusion. So, well, you talk about like the presence or absence of information about the production cost. And I'm not sure if it's still in the scope of the paper or not, but I'm wondering whether there is a difference in a case where, like, you know that let's say that the production cost is kind of stable over time versus another case in which like the production cost like varies a lot from time to time. I don't know if that makes any difference.
This is a very, very interesting question because so auction theory is tough. It's really tough. Now, I really started with a very standard setting. And I introduced just one small modification, but indeed there are some few pages of calculation in order to arrive to all the results and to interpret all the results. So you are right that the production cost can change, and moreover, you are right that the public buyer may not exactly know the production cost of one supplier, because what I think is really happening in this case is not that the public buyers knows the exact cost up to the last ruble, but probably has quite a good idea about the true cost. Much better idea for one supplier, the one which is interacting very often, than from a random guy which is coming from the other part of Russia. So this is what's happening. But introducing this signal, this is a signal if you want, so that the public buyer is receiving a signal, a stronger signal, a signal which is closer to the true cost for one guy with respect to the other. Introducing this idea of signal complicates the model a lot. And that's the reason why we tried it, but I mean, if you want to maintain this level of generality, and above all, if you want not to specify the distribution function of the cost, I'm not really able to introduce what you are suggesting. But you are right that in the reality, this is what is really happening. My expectation is that the result of the model would not drastically change, as long as you have this asymmetry between the information the public buyer has on one guy and the information the public buyer has on some other guy, on the other guy. But I cannot prove it, essentially.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bernardo, anything further?
Not for now, at least.
Okay, good. Anyone else, please? Any further questions, comments? Riccardo, a couple of things, if I may. First, about the model, if you will, or the general approach. As far as I understand, you argue that initial auctions could reveal some information that the auctioneer can use down the road to set reserve price. And
Leonid, sorry, I will close the windows because we have the bell which are singing.
okay, all right, thanks, sure.
Okay, sorry, because they are singing like a concert, so it's a bit different.
No, it's an excellent sound. So too bad we cannot hear it. But anyway, my understanding of your work, of your paper, is that excuse me, you use data collected at the first auction to set the reserve price, and that reserve price improves the efficiency of the auction down the road. Correct?
Yep.
Well, that resembles to me a more general setting whereby you observe a certain process, a dynamic process that unfolds over a period of time. And the information you collect at early stages of this process can be used to make some decisions down the road. So you learn first, and then you use that learning in the future. And this is a well-known environment in the operation research. This is sometimes known as the optimal stoppage rule. How long you observe so that you've learned enough to make use of your observations. And there is a trade-off. The longer you observe, the more information you collect. But while you're waiting to make a decision based on observations, you're incurring some losses. So that leads to the question as to, would it be possible to think about a more general, flexible framework whereby you do not have to set the reserve price after the first auction? Maybe you can wait a little bit longer. Maybe you can have several auctions and then set the reserve price, in which case your decision will be more precise, although you will not have the advantages of a reserve price early on. And maybe you can also think about adjusting this reserve price. So you don't set it once and forever after the first auction, but it will be a process of adaptive learning of some sort. You collect some information, adjust the reserve price as necessary. So that might be a useful generalization of what you've done so far. And my second thought is, given the present environment in Russia, for example, quite clearly there's been a dramatic shock that very strongly affects the environment where auctions take place, but auctions still do take place. And in such case, the reserve prices and other information that you learned before becomes less valuable, becomes quite possibly irrelevant, because the suppliers don't have access to production facilities or imports or whatnot that were before. And that probably calls for some fine-tuning or readjustment. So the reserve price that was collected before this shock might be of lesser significance. So it's a practical question. If you want to efficiently organize public procurement in Russia these days, on the one hand, you cannot have it as an everything goes event, but on the other hand, quite clearly, you should somehow reflect that the rules of the game have changed a great deal. So anything you can say on this?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, because those are two relevant points. It comes to my mind also the literature that studies whether you should accept a job offer or you should wait in order to find a better one. Now, I see it in that way. Well, of course, you can set a super high reserve price, a non-binding reserve price, to be more precise. So let's suppose the production cost is 10, you set a reserve price of 1,000. This is non-binding and it is exactly equivalent as not setting a reserve price. Why you should do that? I think you should do that in a situation, waiting, of course, to gain information, as you suggest. I think you should do that in a situation where the production costs are learned through the bid. Now, if you assume that the production costs are learned through the bid, this is exactly what you're saying. That is, the bidder knows, the potential bidders, the suppliers knows that the bids they are submitting in the auction in t equals 0 in the first period will be used not only to determine the winner in this first auction, but also to determine the reserve price in the next auction t equal 1. So maybe it could be a good strategy in this setting for the public buyer to commit not to set a binding reserve price for a few periods in order to gain this information. And then either by surprise or because the committed period ends, you will suddenly use this information whenever it is the best moment to do that. So this is, I think, so it all boils down in the channel through which the public buyer learns the cost, the signal on the cost of the suppliers. Because if instead the public buyer is learning the signal through the execution of the contract, that is through something which cannot be avoided by the winning supplier, then there is nothing the winning supplier can do to prevent the public buyer learning this cost. And in this case, my model holds. But I perfectly agree with you that my model no longer holds in the previous case. And in the previous case, you should look for a different setting. Now, our main argument why we do not, a setting where the bids are used to determine the reserve price in subsequent auction, the bids, and not simply the contract execution, is a super complex setting. I could imagine this is the case for auction worth, sorry, I'm saying in euro because I don't know exactly the conversion with Capolo. I can imagine this in auction worth €1 million or 10 million euro or 100 million euro, but the auction we have in our data are for a very, very small amount, like 1,000 euro, the equivalent of 1,000 euro, 2,000 euro. It could be, but we think this so sophisticated bidding behavior, both on the bidder side and on the public buyer side, for auction, which is with such a low value, is the main argument why we are defending this assumption. But this is an assumption. Of course, if you do not believe in this assumption, as you said, then you're going to look for you need to look at a different model, and the suggestion you give is very nice, and maybe we can incorporate something in the paper about that. And well, thank you for the second one, because this is a nice robustness check that we can try. So we do have data. Yep, we do have data between 2011 and 2013. So maybe we can look to some shock which impacted the whole Russian during that period. Or maybe we can look for some local shock, I don't know, but we can think on that. I will speak with Elena and the other co-authors about whether we do have some shock during these 3 years. And if we do have some shock during these 3 years, this is a very good robustness check to check what happened in this case. So really, yes, thank you very much. Those are two very nice.
Okay, all right. Thanks, Riccardo. I appreciate the feedback. Anyone else, please? Any further comments on Riccardo's paper, how to organize procurement in a dynamic process? Nothing so far as I can see. Riccardo, again, many thanks. We appreciate your presenting here. We will definitely stay in touch on this and other matters. Public procurement remains one of the key thematic priorities of the center, so look forward to having you and other colleagues involved in this important field down the road. And in the meantime, our seminar for this year for this academic year is winding down, but we still have a couple of presentations in the pipeline as far as I know. So Bernard, could you please remind us what to expect before the end of the academic year?